We're continuing to discuss events in Gaza. I'm curious, when does this end? What do you think, Brianna? All right, I guess my question, though, is why wouldn't Hamas just surrender given those conditions, given that their people are facing the calamity and the catastrophe you've just described, that children are dying, that people don't have water, hundreds died? Wouldn't we expect, when does surrender come?
I think
isn't there some obligation on them to do that?
I think the surrender comes when the occupation of Gaza is ended, because that's what this fight is about.
But that's never going to happen and is totally unrealistic.
It's never going to happen that a population of 2.3 million people should ever live outside of an
We're not talking about should. We're talking about, on should, I agree with you.
I hope the Palestinians stop fighting, because I don't know.
Well, then hundreds and thousands are going to die.
Right. Well, I think a lot of people, every slave revolt, every Warsaw Ghetto uprising, every occupied and oppressed people in the history of humanity understands, give me freedom or give me death, because most people don't want to live enslaved for the rest of their lives.
I'm living in the present and in reality, and there's going to be thousands and thousands and thousands more deaths based on the actions of the terrorist group that purports to speak for these people.
Well, no, very directly based on the fact that U.S. military aid is being used to affect that tragedy.
No disagreement.
And moreover, the international community has an obligation. I actually interviewed a journalist that many people will be familiar with, Sam Husseini. We've played a lot of his viral clips as he's asked questions of the security comms representatives at these press briefings. And he's been making the point that there is Israel and many other countries around the world are signatories to the Genocide Convention. And if any of the parties to that convention, including many countries who have already said that they believe that Israel is committing a genocide and have been critical of Israel's actions, were to challenge them, were to invoke the Genocide Convention and say, what you're doing here is in violation of the treaty that you've already signed, it would trigger the International Court of Justice doing an investigation that could have accountability for the actors within Israel, whether it's Netanyahu or people on the way down the trail, to be actually responsible in front of an international criminal court for their crimes. And it is very interesting that even those countries that are party to the treaty and who have already said this is a genocide, including Palestine, seem not to have done that. So there's some very interesting questions about there being accountability mechanisms existing right now that are not being used, including not just cutting off funding from the United States, but using some of these international legal mechanisms as well.
Like we both think, though, I'm trying to compare it to other circumstances. Like we both think that Ukraine should not continue to fight their war against Russia. They're going to have to lose that territory eventually anyway. It's a matter of how many people die. They should surrender in terms of continuing to fight this struggle.
Well,
like
no,
I don't think like
exactly
the
right,
people
Robby.
in China, the Uyghurs are oppressed by the Chinese government, but I don't think they should start kidnapping random Chinese people, or even spitting at tanks or something. The result is going to be of them being massacred. I would think that was a terrible idea. I think if they were under political leadership that advised that and was prepared to suffer any number of civilian deaths in a feudal struggle against an authoritarian government, I would not recommend that, right?
So for one, you have to really realize that Palestinians were already being massacred before October 7th. Israel had a policy of regularly mowing the lawn and killing hundreds of Palestinians every year, not to mention keeping them in conditions where, again, very few had access to potable water, health care. They have no freedom of access. They're stateless. They don't have the ability to have an airport. They're not have the ability to leave. They have to have special passes to get through checkpoints to go if they have the permission to work in Israel. They are living quite literally not under only apartheid conditions, but substandard inhuman conditions within Gaza to begin with.
And I absolutely support.
But I also, just to say to your point about Ukraine, my argument is not that Ukrainians shouldn't and don't have the right to continue to keep fighting. If Ukrainians feel like their self-determination is at risk and they want to keep fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian is dead, that is their prerogative. What I have concerns about in Ukraine is the United States misrepresenting how much support they were going to get in that cause and then pulling the rug out from under them when it becomes politically inconvenient for the United States of America. It's also a difference because many of the Ukrainians in the contested region actually were very sympathetic, frankly, to Russia. This was a Russian-speaking region, and the problem there was an ongoing civil war in Ukraine where a not insignificant number of Ukrainians actually did want to have a closer relationship with Russia. This is not that scenario here in Palestine.
But it's just as hopeless, is my point. And I mean, they have the right. If you're right, they want to resist. If they want to fight tooth and nail until literally the entire piece of land is destroyed, that's their right to do that. But we're going to sit here horrified as it happens, wishing it wouldn't.
But we could do more than wish it wouldn't. That's the issue. If they're literally using American bombs to enact the genocide,
I would not send those
the blood
bombs
is on our
anyway.
Hands.
Well, the blood is not on, right. I would prefer a situation where it's not on our hands because we don't fund it. But I think the Israeli government would continue regardless.
And the other part of it is, there's this questions about what's the rest of the Arab world doing. The Sam Husseini on this episode of my podcast again was talking about America's looking the other way on Israel's nuclear program. To what extent does America basically allowing, enabling that nuclear program also create a dynamic in the region where there is an unwillingness for Arab nations that the world keeps saying, well, why aren't you taking care of the Palestinians? Palestinians are Jordanians. You hear this kind of rhetoric all the time. Do they really have an ability to intercede the way they might have and have, frankly, in historical years past, given that it's an open secret that Israel has nuclear weapons? So there's a lot of ways that American foreign policy...
Although I saw reporting from Haaretz, which you've quoted favorably on a number of occasions, saying that behind closed doors, Arab leaders are telling Israel that they hate Hamas and they want them to proceed with no care whatsoever in the destruction of that organization.
Hamas was a selection of Netanyahu's government, specifically because he knew that it was a less sympathetic group to be leading Palestinians. Remember,
let me finish this. Behind the scenes, almost every leader in the region, including in most of the Gulf states, is urging Israel to end the war only after Hamas is defeated, since they view the organization as a dangerous domestic enemy.
Yeah, well, I don't. So what do you take from that?
Right. Well, you're talking about all this pressure on Israel to stop doing what they're doing, and actually, the people, even the Arab governments in the region, don't. I mean, this is a sad situation with the Palestinians that their autocratic, not real government is despised, is an outlaw and fugitive, and everyone wants to destroy them.
Let me ask you this: why do you think it's private conversations that are happening of those Arab leaders? Because publicly, they're not saying that.
Right.
Publicly, they know that they have to be more in line with what the people in those Arab nations want, which is that they have strong solidarity with the resistance movement coming out of Gaza. But the leaders of those Arab nations have been under criticism for a long time from their people because those are the ones who have been signing a lot of these deals with the West, with Israel, in the interest of economic interest, oil interest, et cetera, and have been agreeing to some of these so-called compromises that have tried to normalize relationship with Israel in the region, despite the ongoing humanitarian.
I guess what I'm saying is no one is going to come to the aid of the Palestinians.
Well, that's a very fatalistic statement, and I think that what
death and destruction until Hamas is defeated or surrenders.
Millions of protesters around the world, and the overwhelming majority of people outside of Israel, including the overwhelming majority of protesters in the United States, are supportive of a ceasefire. Again, majorities of American citizens support a ceasefire because they see literal babies that were left to rot in incubators, who were left there for so long that some of their bodies were eaten by feral dogs.
I know, but the Israelis don't support a ceasefire, and Hamas doesn't actually want a ceasefire.
Right, but this is the barbarity that most of the world is standing up against. So the question is whether it's through a boycott, divest, and sanction movement, whether it's because of political pressure on people like Nancy Pelosi, whether it's because of people like Lloyd Austin twisting Joe Biden's arm and saying that you're going to have a much bigger Hamas problem down the line if you don't do something about this now. That's the kind of pressure people are hoping to exert to change things here.
And I hope they're successful at spending American tax dollars at home, for sure. But I'm quite worried that this will.
And look at Macron, who did a flip on the basis of the protests that were happening in France. We are seeing a lot of movement here, and I would encourage people not to take such a fatalistic view, just subjectively.
More Rising right after this.